impacts on life. But there's also no doubt that the Deccan Traps volcanism was occurring at that time. There's absolutely no doubt. We certainly can't date the lavas as accurately as you can date some of the things he talked about. But I asked a question at the end. So sorry, guys, we're talking about the talk yesterday that was Adrian. We had a guest speaker yesterday. We're trying to do a couple department seminars, and this is a guy named Tim Braylauer who was talking about some research on the Chicxulub impact crater and sort of the evidence that he was looking specifically at kind of evidence that there was a localized hydrothermal system in the actual impact crater site for some time that would have affected the biology of the site, which is pretty cool. But he also, talked about a lot of other things with the impact. And for those of you that haven't had any, haven't ever talked about impacts, this is actually potentially a relevant thing in that, if you look at the moon, you see it's covered by craters. And you look at the Earth, and we don't seem to be as covered by craters, even though we're much bigger than the moon. And we know that part of impact rates depends on how big a planet is, right? Because if you're a bigger planet, you're a bigger mass, you exert more gravity. So you actually expect to draw more stuff in to get hit. And that Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which was about 66 million years ago, is really one of the first times that we've been able to document a mass extinction event directly related to a meteorite impact. And there, like I was just saying with volcanism, there's other things going on that might have been stressing the non-avian dinosaur populations, right? Because birds are actually dinosaurs. They're a direct lineage back to the avian dinosaurs. Yeah, so it was an interesting talk. Anyways, I don't want to get off that on that topic too much. We can come back to it at the end. I want to take advantage of having an esteemed alum, Adrian Biscontini, with us today. Adrian is he graduated when we were still in the Department of Geology, I think, weren't we?
Yep.
Yeah, and so Adrian kind of took a classic geology degree, but he did lots of stuff. He did a couple of different research projects. He co-authored a paper that got published in a pretty high-profile geology journal as an undergrad. So he was a great example of a student taking advantage of a lot of the different experiences that you can find at a small liberal arts college like Dickinson. But he's gone on now, and I'll let him tell you what he's done. I like your background, Adrian.
Thanks.
It's very appropriate. You can see the plants on the wall. Yeah, so this is a soils class. It didn't exist when Adrian was a student here, or he might have taken it. Yeah, he's gone on to get lots of experience, practical experience with soils. And so I'm just going to let him tell you a little bit about his pathway, what he's done in the past, what he's doing now. And then when he's done, we'll open it up for questions, and you guys can ask him anything you'd want to ask an alum who's been out in the world being successful after graduating.
Thanks a lot, Ben. It's good to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I graduated 2006, geology degree. And after that, I was working for the U.S. Geological Survey, which is something that started as an internship for credit. And I kept working there for a year. And then after that, I moved up to around Portland, Maine for a couple of years and worked at Environmental Science Lab. And then that kind of took me to find some people that were really interested in farming. And just as a whim, some summer I tried it as an intern in upstate New York and really loved it. And kind of found my calling right there and figured I'd kind of make a go for it. And so I started in Binghamton, New York. I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania, so it was just a short hike over the border to start my farm there. And then after, that was 2012 that I started there. And a couple of years of doing that, then I bought a place up where I live now in Berkshire, New York. So I've been farming up here since 2015. And last year was actually the only year that I didn't grow any crops other than cover crops, because I was busy at this consulting job that I've been working at. But my plan has always been to get back to farming. And so it happened a little bit sooner than I thought, but I just left that position at the consulting job, and now I'm getting back to farming full time. So I'm looking forward to doing that. But the consulting job is really interesting. I think it's a good way to kind of see what a kind of career position in agriculture could be if you're not actually out there getting your hands dirty. What that job did, it was for a company called Dairy One, an agriculture consulting service. So our biggest clients were the giant dairies that are actually up here. We're talking several thousand head of cows, several thousand acres, 4,000 acres. And all these farms that are CAFO sized has to be regulated. They have to regulate, what kind of, mostly where the manure is going, because as you can imagine, those animals produce a lot of manure and they can't just spread it just anywhere. And New York has some pretty strict regulations as far as that. So we kind of took care of that for the farms. So that was mostly what the job started as, is figuring out where manure would go on these farms. And over years, that company has grown to include things like fertility management. So we kind of tell them where to put manure, and then tell them, based on this kind of soil that you got, you're going to need a little bit more of these kind of nutrients to it to add to grow a successful crop of corn or hay. And then they also we're going into spray recommendations. So one of my jobs there was to be a scout and check a bunch of cornfields or alfalfa and kind of look for pests or diseases or any kind of nutrient deficiencies, and then report back to the agronomist that would then make the recommendations. So that was mostly what that was. And then just in the past couple of years, being that dairy is a pretty tough business, it has its ups and downs, we were trying to diversify. So we were getting into crop scouting for vegetables and fertility and spray requirements for them. So these past couple of years, I've been working mostly in Western New York, where there's big crop farms looking at snap beans and sweet corn, and even some brassicas like broccoli and cabbage. So we've been doing a lot of that, again, looking for any kind of problems that could be out there, from fertility to pests. And all that kind of ties into our company has pretty great software that we use to manage the fertility. So we take soil tests every year on farms, usually once every 3 years for each individual field. And those soil tests are kind of the basis of how we make recommendations. And all that kind of goes into a pretty complicated software that we have that has all the soil types. So I don't know if you guys have been on the web soil survey and kind of getting familiar with your local soil types, but you could see kind of how varied they are. It could be pretty interesting to see. I know up here we have everything from extremely sandy ground to very hard clay. And that all kind of plays a big role into how you manage that field. They take very different amounts of nutrients, or even pH adjustments, things like that. So being that these farms are so big, there's no way that they have somebody qualified to manage their thousands of acres as intensely as needs to be for a good crop. So yeah, basically we, after taking the soil tests and getting them in our database, the agronomists will kind of go through, and the first thing they do is kind of figure out how much manure the farm is producing, and then how to get that on the fields at the right timing to kind of conserve as much nutrition that's in that manure as possible. I don't know if you guys have learned anything about the macronutrients and micronutrients, but the big one is nitrogen. That's a big thing for all crops to grow, and they need a lot of nitrogen, and that has unfortunate quality of kind of evaporating into the air. So that's one that we almost have to add every year, no matter what. But there's a lot that we could do to manage to keep that in the ground by spreading manure at the right time and then tilling it into the ground by incorporating it in some way. And that could actually kind of save a lot of that from evaporating into the air and be there for the next year's crop. One of the other things that we do a lot is pH management. So usually the kind of fertilizers and manure that they use usually bumps the pH into the acidic range year after year. So every couple of years we want them to manage their pH by adding some lime is pretty common. So that they mine the lime and then dump it on the fields, and that'll help kind of make more of the nutrients more available. As you kind of get out of pH range, above 6.5 to 7 or 8 range, or down below 6, there's some interesting charts you can find online that those minerals really become unavailable. They lock up in different kind of chemical ways. That's pretty complicated and pretty interesting to see how, how they could become unavailable, and you could have really some bad crop problems when all your problem is, you can look like you don't have enough phosphorus, but it's really just a pH lockout issue. So there's really interesting kind of chemistry that's involved in that. And that kind of goes hand in hand with another quality that we measure called CEC, or cation exchange capacity. So that kind of measures the soil's ability to hold on to positive ions. These are the big things like calcium and phosphorus that you need but some sandy soils, that kind of leach right through. So they might have lower CEC, where clays and organic matter are great for holding on to that nutrition. So those soils need to be kind of managed a little bit differently, depending on, what kind of soil type there is. And then both of those, the pH and the CEC, also kind of play into the percent base saturation, which is kind of something I've been interested into and trying to learn more about, because it's a really interesting relationship between how those elements are being held in the soil, and then what actually makes them available in the soil. So that has to do with the proportion of acids and bases and elemental kind of compounds that are locked into the soil. So that's basically a lot of what we did and what I learned at the consulting job. They had some pretty nice scientific labs, that I can kind of toy around with and look into. And that's kind of how they made had their great recommendations. I mean, they did a really super job at keeping these farms compliant and keeping them growing great crops year after year. The thing that I didn't like that much, I'm not much of a kind of synthetic guy. I've always farmed organically here at my farm. So that's kind of one thing that I'm more interested in. And that's kind of a different management cycle. It's a different way. We don't really, the kind of fertilizers that we buy are usually only come from 3 sources. Mostly it's interesting to focus on nitrogen, because that's the one you have to replace every year. And there's only 3 ways to get organic nitrogen. Either you're mining it from a place in Chile, which is kind of just an interesting geologic anomaly that there's, I think it's sodium nitrate that they mine, which is, one of the ways to get it, but not exactly the most environmentally friendly when you think about shipping that all the way from Chile. And then the other way to get it is passing it through animals. So most of the fertility I get up here is coming from a chicken farm. So they compost their chicken manure, which is pretty high in nitrogen. They compost that and then kind of deliver it here in bulk. And I spread that, and it's basically like a compost by the time it comes to me. Very high in organic matter also. And then the only other way to get it is to grow it. So what I got now out in my field is a bunch of cover crops. I got some rye and clover in some of the patches, and then some peas and oats. And so legumes like the peas and the clover are some of the only crops that actually take nitrogen out of the air and fix it on nodules in the ground. And then that's the only way you can kind of get a net increase of that kind of nitrogen. And then the rye and the oats will serve as a source of organic matter. So this organic matter will feed the microbes that are in the soil, and they will help slowly release that nutrition as the year goes. So hopefully provide some pretty healthy crops for next year. But yeah, so all those kind of will increase your tilth. I don't know if you guys have talked about tilth yet, but basically how the ground works. You could see a big difference in my field versus managing it. I used to use a rototiller a lot, and that will really till up the ground pretty nicely, but it can lead to some kind of compaction issues. And it's kind of been moving more towards more low till kind of ways. It's tough because when I still have to kill those grasses out there and kill those weeds, I got to do something And so the plow has definitely been a pretty big role in the farm, but trying to get away from the rototiller and other things that can add to compaction. And my ground here has an interesting but unfortunate habit of not draining very well. I have a fragipan, which is kind of an interesting chemical layer of almost impermeable ground that usually is about 2 feet below the ground. So I've been trying to deal with different organic methods of either using a subsoiler, something that tills very deeply and breaks it up. And now that that's why I've moved to using the rye cover crop, because that's supposed to kind of help break that up. And I've been following some interesting research out of Kentucky that says that there's actually some kind of a chemical reaction going on to help break that up. So it's been really fun to kind of see how different, management practices can affect the ground, and you find what works and what doesn't work. And, as you see the various types of soil out there, there's 100 different ways to manage different soil types. So you always kind of got to find what works for you, and then, what it works economically for your own farm. So yeah, that's just basically the kind of the overview of what I've been up to. So if you guys got any questions, I'm here.
I have a million questions.
Okay.
But we don't have to go through all of them, of course. Do you want to talk about, go ahead, Ben.
I just say, no, this is why Adrian's here. You ask all the questions you want.
All right. I don't want to I want to let other people ask questions too. So I'm curious about your consulting gig specifically. I'm also curious about your farm, and but I guess we'll start with the consulting gig. So it's called Dairy One, you said, right?
Yeah, it was Dairy One is the name of the company. And just as I was there, they incorporated agriculture consulting service, which is really the consulting kind of job. Dairy One was mostly like a milk lab, a forage lab, that kind of things. And now they've kind of expanded into the consulting and doing precision agriculture also.
Okay, so when did you start working there? How long ago? 2015?
That was so this was my 3rd season, this past season working there.
Okay. And do you feel like, because it's from my understanding of what you're saying, it's kind of like it's a big scale operation, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of factory farmed meat, you would say, or cows, stuff like that. So it's a lot of the stuff that we're hearing about is not great for the environment and all that kind of stuff. But you said that there's some things that are kind of starting to move away from, you mentioned tilling to like a low till kind of thing. You mentioned spraying too. Like one of the things you do is you scout so that whoever recommends spraying can recommend the spraying. Can you speak a little bit on, like, is there any movement in your consulting business or just the industry on thinking about moving away from spraying?
The spraying, not as much. I've seen more in the past just couple of years that cover crops are being, much more intensely managed. There's still some farms that don't use them, but a lot of them are realizing that it makes economic sense. And that's the thing for these farms, that it all matters on economic sense. They can't do it otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean, these big farms are making big money, but they're also spending big money. So the only thing that's really pushing guys to think differently about spraying is the amount of herbicide-resistant crops, herbicide-resistant weeds that are out there. That amount is growing exponentially, and they're running out of new modes of action, what they call new ways to kind of kill these crops. So Roundup, is pretty famous for being used everywhere, but there's more and more weeds that are developing resistance to it. And so there's a little bit of movement of people thinking like, all right, we can't keep doing this the same way. So they're doing a little bit better at rotating the kinds of spray that they use. So they're not just hammering it with one type that works in one way. They'll use a spray that maybe will attack a certain like phosphorus inhibitor, and then the next spray they'll use something else that's like more of a chlorophyll inhibitor, just so that they don't keep building it up. But it's just the fact that if they keep using this way, eventually they're going to run out of things to spray. It's a really kind of panic out there.
Yeah, they have to keep developing new things because new problems arise. So one of the things that's, from my understanding, is bad about the spraying is it kills the life in the soil. And it's usually not, it can be specific, whether it be a fungicide or herbicide or a pesticide, whatever. but the life of this in the soil is very important for the plant growth, right? Like the microbiome of the soil. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I don't even know if that's a term, but
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So there's, I guess you were saying it's really about money, essentially, when it comes down to what's the most economically feasible way to run your operation. From what I understand, you're saying there's not like a lot of interest in trying to get to a more regenerative approach to farming in like the big industry. It seems to be more like economically incentivized and not like what's good for the soil, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's the problem they're having, it's a very slow degradation of the soil. So it's really hard to see even over 20 years. So it's one of those things that's not really, they're not like, oh man, we used a spray this year and like our crops are way, way worse. It happens at such a slow rate that, I don't think it's very apparent to them.
Yeah.
And I think there's still a lot of research to be done as far as the microbiome of the soil. I mean, we still don't know what's going on out there. And it's really just in the past couple of years started to realize, the role that can play.
Yep.
But with using synthetics, you kind of replace that and you give the corn everything it needs to get huge that year. And I'd like to see more research done, especially on human crops, on vegetables, where, all right, maybe that, plant looks great, but maybe it's lacking something that the fungi or the microbes would have given it that would lead to a more nutritious plant and nutritious for us to eat. When you're feeding corn to cows, it's, they're not really taking that close of a look at it, but hopefully, some more research will be done because there's just so much going on underneath the soil that we don't know about. And I think that we are very slowly, degrading our soils, but it's gonna catch up with us eventually.
Have you heard there's a common kind of thing that we have like 60 years left of topsoil? Have you ever heard that going around?
Yeah, I have, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so one other question real quick to get away from this. Have you ever heard of any like GIS consulting, or have you used GIS?
Yeah, so our company uses GIS. We have like a sister company that we use for our mapping. And that's one of the jobs that I did as a scout also, is whenever a farm would pick up a new field, I would have to go out to this field and look for any kind of waterways that they could pollute, look for any ditches. And also I'd be taking a slope measurement. So I'd go out there and say, all right, this slope is 9%. And that would go all into our calculations of, what crops we could put on that and how much manure we could put at it. And then, for the waterways, we'd usually have to put a setback. So we'd say, all right, you can't spread manure within 20 feet of the stream because then it'll go right into the stream. So we kind of contract all that work out through our sister company that does the mapping, and we can kind of create really nice maps for the companies and for the farms. And a lot of time they sublet out who spreads the manure, so they can just give their maps to the guy and say, all right, don't spread manure here, don't do that. So it's definitely a big role. And I think moving forward, we're starting to do more stuff with imagery. So we just started to take this NDVI using drones or something to measure how much nitrogen is in the crops. And that's something that we've tried to start to push into as far as nitrogen management, because that's obviously a very, very important element for the crops. And we're trying to figure out a better way to kind of critique where we've been putting that. And, there's some zones where we can put a lot more and get a higher yield. So that's kind of where they're moving as far as precision agronomy is concerned.
So you'd say the industry is growing. Would you agree with that, of the GIS consulting or just kind of agro consulting industry?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think GIS is just the start too. With more advanced kind of mapping techniques, I'm sure they're going to find kind of more ways. And I mean, we have the equipment that these guys use are hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tractors, and they have very advanced, instruments on them that can read, dry matter or yield. And so we make maps out of that. So it's all that kind of goes into the kind of mapping GIS world, and they could use that extensively to kind of help fine tune what they're doing. So it's definitely a good thing to know.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I just would point out for, because one of the things that I've done at Dickinson in the last couple of years is we have a drone fleet now, and we use it for a bunch of different things, but including flying at the farm. And so I always encourage students to think about it, but that you can actually get specific commercial grade drones now that are specifically aimed for agribusiness. So they have multispectral cameras that you can take pictures with that can tell you some different things about nutrients. And they also, I don't know if you've seen this yet, Adrian, I haven't seen it, but there's I want to get to the next level of drone. You got to get something that's a little bit bigger than the ones I have. But they make drones now that have sprayers.
Yeah.
So you can actually, as opposed to hiring a plane, which is just going to spray crap all over a field, theoretically with one of these big drones, you can fly over your field 5 feet above the plants. And if you see a weed, you can basically stop and hover and drip a few drops of a pesticide basically just on the weed and then fly to the next weed. And so, that is still time intensive. You got to fly kind of slowly if you're going to spot weeds. Yeah, so I'm glad to see that you've your company was using that for low-level flights. I've got to go out and fly a wetland area here for the NRCS in just a bit. They've got a farm by the Conde de Gwinnett locally where a guy got some money from them to put in a little wetland restoration because he's got farm fields that are right by the Conde de Gwinnett Creek. And so I went out and flew before they did the restoration project. I'm going to go back out and fly sometime the next week or two as they started to put it in. And some of it's just photo documentation. But essentially, with the drone, you essentially have it's like a satellite image, except your resolution can be anything. If you hover the drone 5 feet above the ground, your resolution's a few millimeters. So it's another, and the drone stuff, all the pictures, the drones have a GPS, so all the pictures are geotagged, so you can actually bring them into a GIS system, and they already are geolocated. Yeah, lots of exciting things there.
Mm-hmm.
I had a quick question for you, Adrian.
Yep.
So I was just kind of wondering how big your firm is currently, and have you thought about reaching out to the Dickinson Farm alumni for if you need people? I guess if you do everything yourself, or do you hire out seasonal workers, and the type of crops that you mainly focus on? I mean, you said you just did cover crops, but in the future, are you looking at doing maybe corn for ethanol, or are you looking at fresh produce? Like, what kind of stuff are you thinking about?
Yeah, so I've always done just organic vegetables for people and selling in town. I've done most of the work myself. I've hired in some people occasionally to, for big harvest days or something like that. And over the past couple of years, now I've actually formed a really good relationship with some neighbor farmers who have just started up. So now I kind of sell all my products through them, which is a great relationship because it was hard for me to do everything. And I'm a little bit better at growing crops than I am at marketing, and I never really liked that kind of stuff. So it's great that they kind of got that under control. They hit a bunch of farmers markets, and I usually give them a share of what we make during the day. And that way I don't have to spend all Saturday at the farmers market, and I can keep doing work or have some free time. And then they also kind of got a whole bunch of my customers that I've been building through the past couple of years. I introduced them, and they mostly do meat. I mostly do vegetables, so that works. I only have 4 acres of ground here that I currently work. And I'm kind of moving to a cycle of only using half of it. So only probably doing 2 acres per year. And then the other half will be in cover crops. I think if I do that for a couple more years, I can really improve the ease that which I farm. Mostly it's battling weeds. And, after you let a couple weeds go to seed and you're just screwed. These weeds can produce 1 million seeds per plant, and you'd never stay on top of them. So if you take a fallow year and just do cover crops, I've seen that work tremendously as far as reducing the weed seed bank, as they call it, in the soil, getting them all to germinate and then killing them before they ever get a chance to go to seed. And after doing that, there's some really great Amish Pennsylvania farmers called the Nordells that have been farming with horses for a long time. And the only weeds they have right now are the tomatoes that sprout from last year's crop. I mean, which is incredible to think they go out there with a little bucket, for 20 acres and pick a handful of weeds, and that's all they got. So that's my dream to get to that area, but it requires intense management. I mean, for years they were going out there and hand picking weeds and making sure not a single one went. And that's probably too intense for me to do. But I mean, they were Amish. They didn't really have like Netflix or anything. So, but I think that'll work for me in the meantime. And I'm doing that. And I'd like to, it's nice to hire some people, but it's already kind of a struggle to make a living on the farm. And I plan on still working part-time gigs, and I'm trying to find some winter work too. And that's always how it's been, is just kind of piecing together a life. And that's kind of why I went for that consulting gig for a while. But then I ended up just working off the farm a whole lot, and that wasn't very fun either. So that's kind of why I've made the transition back. And I know kind of enough people now that give me part-time work and can work trade and just kind of scrounge out a living. And that's been good enough.
Great. Yeah. Just one more quick question from me real quick.
Yep.
So for someone who might be interested in doing this in the future, was working at the Dickinson firm for 2 years. I spent a summer wolfing in Europe through organic farming. What would you say would be the best, do you have any tips and tricks? Do you suggest, going furthering your education specifically in soil science, or do you suggest getting hands-on work as just a farm hand, or what do you suggest starting out with?
It's always great to have some kind of educational background in any kind of science. But I don't think you need a master's to start farming either. I wouldn't go that far. It's always kind of nice, but if you could find the best farmer around the area that you want to settle and work for them, even for a couple of years, I think a lot of farming has to do with the process. It has to do with how exactly do I use this tool to plant this crop? How do I manage the weeds effectively? And that's kind of hard to learn unless you're there with your hands in dirt on a farm that's making it work. The farm that I apprenticed at was not making it work very well. So that was kind of interesting to see what not to do. But I always wish that I had taken one more summer and go and find some farm that's just killing it. That's just, has a really great market and has great crops and is doing really well. And I've been lucky that I've had some friends in this area that have been doing very well. And so building that relationship with them and then getting to know other farmers in the area and just peppering them with questions all the time, being like, how I had this problem, how do you fix this? And they've really held my hand through some bad mistakes that I've made, and been like, yeah, I've been there too. This is how you fix it and kind of get through. But yeah, there's definitely some good science to know as far as farming goes, but a lot of it has to do with just the process and just the manual labor, the work, or getting the tools to work. And then if you want to start your own farm, I'd say start small, start part-time in your spare time while you got a full-time job. Don't make that leap too soon, because it's really tough to get started. It's really nice. I've seen some guys start part-time while they had a full-time job, and then you do that for a couple of years as they build their client base. And then at some point, they have 50 or so families that love what they do, and then they can kind of figure out a way to make the leap. And it's a tough leap though, to go from full-time paid work to then trying to make your own living. But depending on what area you are, you could definitely make it work.
Great. Thank you so much.
What are your thoughts on different alternative agriculture practices like polyculture or different techniques?
Yeah, I've been interested in permaculture, polyculture. I think it's great on a small scale, but when you're trying to produce, it doesn't seem like 4 acres is a lot, but I could really churn out a good amount of produce here, and it really, you have to plant plants in rows. You have to plant families together. I really wish I can kind of do more interplanting and things, but when it comes to harvest time or, cultivation and weeding, it just doesn't work. You know, I have a tractor that I cultivate with just some sweeps and things, and I can't have 4 different kinds of crops in there with different maturation times. I kind of just got to have squash in this row, and this is how I take care of it, and this is how I fertilize it. And but I've seen, like, we have a local urban farm here, which I've been you know, kind of volunteering for, and they're doing a really nice job because they have a bunch of volunteers that can interplant and weed by hand, and it's been a great learning tool for at-risk kids in our area to kind of learn, hey, this is what farming is, this is where vegetables come from. But as far as if you're gonna you know, kind of do it for money, you got to realize you got to turn out a bunch of stuff. I mean, there's a bunches of kale that goes into making, you know, $30,000-$40,000 a year. It's pretty tough. So you got to make a little bit of a, you know, concession there and say, all right, I can't do any kind of any of the things that you might see on, you know, some websites. But for small scale stuff, for home gardening, it's great, and I've seen it work really well.
I guess it seems like a lot of your experience in terms of like what your knowledge is now comes from real applicable work in the real world and like what you've been doing. How much of that was your Dickinson experience, and then how much of it was really just doing the trial and error of the work that you've actually been doing throughout after you graduated? And then also, I guess, what do you think about your career from this point if you were to go back and like look at yourself during your college years?
Yeah, I think Dickinson did play a role. I mean, I had really good experience with the geology department, and it's very applicable, you know, just thinking about how science works. You know, chemistry, having a chemistry background, having some chemistry there was really nice. I wish that I could taken more geology classes. I wish I'd taken some kind of biology classes and some botany classes as well. That would have been helpful, and that's something I'm thinking about doing kind of in the future. But when you're first starting farming, you can kind of ignore some of that and work on the process. But when you're really trying to diagnose problems, really trying to figure out why this didn't work, it helps hugely to have some kind of a science background, a chemistry background, to realize, all right, what's going on in the soil when I add this lime? What's happening to my nitrogen? You know, why isn't it here anymore? And that kind of plays a huge role. And when I was at Dickinson, I had no idea I was going to farm at all. That was not even a job I considered. So after I came out of Dickinson, I was, you know, trying to find science-based jobs. It was a little bit hard. That's when we were kind of, you know, 2008, there was a pretty major recession. So that was a little bit hard. And then, as I said, I just kind of fell into farming, and I loved it. I realized how that kind of married my love of science and my love of being outdoors. So I was pretty lucky that I kind of stumbled into it. And I'm happy to see that. I mean, I wish the Dickinson farm was there when I was there. Maybe it would have happened my sophomore year, you know, instead of a couple of years after I graduated. So I'm glad, you know, I visited there a couple of years ago when they first started, and I've been keeping in touch and seeing how they've grown. So it's definitely a great thing to have out there. And I'm glad that Dickinson is kind of pushing that envelope too, because I think it's going to become important as we kind of move on.
Yeah, great questions, you guys.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I got more, but does anyone else want to ask questions? No? Okay. How much land do you think you need to feed yourself, if you could guess? You said you have 4 acres, you use about 2. Like, do you think you could feed yourself off of that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I definitely do. For me, myself, if you do it intensely, 1/4 an acre is all you need to really feed like one person, probably even less. I mean, if you wanted to add meat into that and you wanted to add grazing ground and stuff, it'd be definitely significantly more. But you can grow a ton of crops on an acre. It's kind of ridiculous. I mean, yeah, I think I haven't kept good weight records recently, but I know at my old farm, I had a 1/2 acre, and I could pull, you know, 20,000 pounds of food out of there, of different squash and potatoes. It is a lot. I mean, you think that's a lot of that is just water weight, you know? So if you pick up a zucchini, that's like 95% water. So you think the elements not that much, but it's an extraordinarily huge amount. And when you add that up over a year, it's no wonder my back hurts, you know. Like it's tough work, but yeah, you could produce a lot of food. It's incredible.
Okay, so I'm planning on moving out to Oregon, me and the lady, after I graduate, and I want to buy land, and I don't know exactly what kind of farming, whether it be like meat or plant. I would theoretically like to do both, but my big concern is the lack of rainfall, essentially, because it's like Oregonish, so it's considered a high desert area. Does it make sense to not to focus more on, like, say, a livestock kind of thing and then not so much on vegetables? Or do you think that with the right irrigation system, vegetables could still be a good feasible option?
I think vegetables would be a better option, actually. You need a lot of water to raise animals, to grow that grass and everything like that. If you don't have steady rain, then that's going to be tough to kind of raise, you know, have your own grass. If you're going to buy in hay or something like that, then it's a little bit different. But using drip irrigation and catching your own rainwater and things like that, and then supplementing it with a well, you could grow probably a lot more vegetables pretty easily than it would be to kind of keep a cow fed and watered. The animals are usually pretty water intensive.
That makes sense. Okay, cool. Can you? Sorry. You mentioned some plants are good at extracting nitrogen from the atmosphere. You were talking about the rye and something else, but that was after that. There was what were you talking about? There was extracted nitrogen from the atmosphere.
So any kind of clover or peas or vetch, they're all in the legume family. So they're some of the only crops that actually take the nitrogen from out of the air, and then they'll form a relationship with like some kind of bacteria in the ground. And actually, when you pull up the roots, you'll see these little nodes on these little white balls, and that's the kind of relationship. And so they will result in a net increase of nitrogen in your soil, which is, you know, some of the only crops that do that.
Are the nodes like a nitrogen bank, like a kind of?
Yeah, it's like a nitrogen. Yeah, there's nitrogen fixing bacteria that kind of work hand in hand. I wish I kind of knew more about the botany behind that, but it's definitely pretty interesting.
We haven't gotten to biology much yet, but we are going to do something on that in a week or two. Yeah, and that's Adrian. I'll try to remember. If the chapter looks good, I'll send you a copy.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's pretty fascinating that the plant roots actually exude chemicals into the soil to essentially invite the right bacteria to come into the plant root, and the bacteria basically infect the plant root. But the place they can infect is limited, and the bacteria essentially get carbohydrates from the plant. So the plant's producing sugars and things like that and sends them down to the roots. And so the bacteria get fed, and the plants in turn get nitrogen from the roots. And of course, when the plants die, you know, if you till the roots or the roots just die in general, then basically that biologically available nitrogen stays in the soil with the dead material until, you know, ultimately can get degraded and released back into the atmosphere. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'll definitely remember, Adrian, to send you any good readings that we have that talk specifically about it, because it's pretty fascinating that some plants have, not all plants, but a limited number of plants have developed this pretty kind of complex relationship. Like, how did the plant figure out to exude this certain chemical that only lets bacteria in that are the kind of bacteria that it wants to fix nitrogen? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, even beyond the nitrogen fixing, there's all kinds of relationship in the soil, all kinds of trading going back and forth. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to learn more about, but like, yeah, the science is still kind of figuring out things, how different fungal or, you know, relationships work. I mean, there's fungal relationships that go right inside the root and will exchange, you know, cations that way, and get something in return. And I mean, especially forest ecology, it could get pretty advanced. I'd like to see more good research about that kind of come about, so we can use it on an industrial scale, because they're starting to use it on like a home grow kind of scale, but I'd like to see more of that kind of bleed its way into industrial use.
Have you heard of Paul Stamets?
Oh yeah, that guy's awesome. He's the best.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah.
Can you real quick? You were talking about the sweet spot of pH being between like 5 or 7 or something like that. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I had that right.
6.5 is what you're shooting for.
6.5 6.5 is a sweet spot, but like what's like a range in between?
Between 6 and 7.
6 and 7. Okay, perfect. And then, what other advanced mapping equipment or technology other than like GIS? And you mentioned like an NDVI. I've never heard of that. Is there anything else that you know of off the top of your head?
I'm not too up to date on like the technology things, but I know on these big farms, I mean, one of the things that they were doing is when they harvest the corn, they have like a yield map that they can make. So you can see this map of, high and low yields throughout the farm. And so there's a way to like clean that data, I guess, and kind of run some programs on it that will take out the highs and lows or errors and use that.
Yeah.
I know there was another person that we were working with that was developing their own app to map dry matter. So when a lot of dairy farms grow silage corn, and it has to be at 35% dry matter to harvest it, so that it ferments correctly in the bunk. But it happens kind of at various, parts of the field a little bit differently. So she was trying to find a way to kind of map that. That's always really interesting. I think even basic topographical maps can be very important as far as finding what farm ground is good. And then I wish when I was trying to find a place to farm, I wish it was easier to find where the good farmland is. Maybe there's something like that already exists, but I can use the web soil survey and kind of look, but it's not very user friendly if I say, hey, I want to find Marden soil. Where's all the Marden soil in this area, and have it kind of be highlighted. Especially this area, we have a lot of big dairy farms that are snagging up all the good ground, but I know that there's some good farmland somewhere out there, and I'd like to be able to find it a little bit easier.
Yeah, so Adrian, again, I'll email you about this, but on the web soil, on the NRCS website, they actually have a thing where you can search for a specific soil series, and it comes up with all the properties. And one of the options is to actually look at a map. So between the web soil survey and the soil web app, which is from UC Davis, both those have ways that you can actually get to maps that'll show you the distribution of a specific soil series.
Okay, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yes, you definitely can find some of that. And some states, I would imagine New York does, but this is another GIS option. Like Pennsylvania, we have 2-meter radar data basically that you can get for any part of the state that produces a digital elevation model. And you can get it for free. The state paid millions of dollars to do this for the whole state. So not every state has that, but there are ways you can get, sort of sub 2-meter resolution for topography. And this, again, I hate to say it, but this is another great technology for these guys. Maybe not things quite this small, but one of the big things that we're doing with drones right now, because we don't have a lot of the special sensors, is just being able to make digital elevation models. So, you can fly a drone at 30 feet above the ground, and you can be mapping the size of dirt clods that are 2 or 3 centimeters. So you can map, it's almost, you have to be careful, because if you get too low, you almost have too much information. There's so much micro topography, especially in a field that maybe has been tilled or whatever, that you could get lost. But that, thinking for jobs, I've been sort of brainstorming as you've been talking about all these things. What are new industries? What are things that farmers can do to supplement their income? I'm trying to convince my brother of this, because he just retired and he's got a little farm in Montana. There is so much to do with drones, and you do not need, a basic drone that you can use for mapping now is probably less than $1,500. And when you talk to farmers who are buying $200,000 tractors, $1,000 drone is, less than their feed bill for like 4 days. And with the GIS, some of you guys are learning what's called QGIS, which is a free software package. So you don't even have to, get ArcGIS, which is going to cost you money. So there's free GIS. A drone is really cheap, and even if you're just making micro topography maps of farms for people so they can really get a handle on erosion control, and looking at really small scale problems where they might have drainage problems because they've oversteepened their soil a little bit. There's a lot to that technology that you have access to as a Dickinson alum. I'll come up and fly your farm anytime you want. And you guys as students, I've been out with Ben a couple of times. Yes, I don't think have you taken the controls yet or not, Ben? With the drone. I'm not sure that you've actually flown it yet, but.
Yeah, no, I did once. Yeah.
So it's pretty easy. You do have to have a license. I have to say that to cover myself. You have to have a license from the Federal Aviation Administration. But quite honestly, one of our students who graduated a couple of years ago found a YouTube video that was like an hour-long video, watched it 3 times, went and took the test the next day, and you only have to get a 70 to pass the test. It's a multiple choice test, and he got like a 90 something. So if you understand basic maps and you do a little bit of studying, it costs $150. And then for 2 years, you get like a little ID card and you're a federally licensed pilot. And then, you can go out and you can start doing this stuff and making money. I mean, it's kind of, well, one of the local drone operators here, I took a class from 2 years ago, and he said at that 2 years ago, there was at least room for probably 600,000 drone operators in this country. There's that much business. And so I think it's a great way to combine technology. You need to know something about the soils to know about, erosion, and to know a little bit about susceptibility based on soil consistency and all these other things. But we're on the verge of a new era where everyone is going to be able to micromanage their lands from the air, which means you're also not stepping on the soil. And you're not driving across the soil, which causes compaction, which is one of the biggest, soil erosion problems, is compacting the soil. So, all right. Well, I should, if you guys want to get in touch with Adrian, I'll check with him. But if it's okay with him, I can send you his email as a Dickinson alum. And but thank you very much. Maybe thumbs up or clap, silent clap. Thanks for taking the morning to spend with us, Adrian. It's great to see you. And and I will keep in mind some of the things. I took notes. I was typing the whole time you were saying this. I've recorded this as well. And I might, like Pete would probably love to see this, and Jordan, and people haven't seen your face in a while. But I'll send the notes out to the class as well, so you can remember what Adrian was telling us about. You covered lots of stuff. We've touched on some of it before. We'll touch on more of this in the future. But it's great to see an alum that's out being successful, doing tons of different things. To me, that's the key about a liberal arts degree, right? Your brain can make connections, which means you can change on a dime. You can switch from one thing to the next. And when you see an opportunity, you can recognize it and you can take advantage of it. And that's the kind of thing that you learn to do, I think, at a liberal arts college better than maybe some other places where you kind of have to put the tunnel vision on because you got to take 400 classes just in your major. And so that's all you see is one thing. Yeah. Anyways, you guys have a great weekend. I'll get your reading up. I have a little soil taxonomy problem set that I'm working on to keep you guys doing a little bit more practice. And Adrian, I'll keep you in mind. When I find readings that are good, I'll send the PDFs to you as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, thank you very much. Good to see you guys.
Yeah. Great to see you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You guys have a great weekend. And see you all Monday.
Can you check real quick? You got the picture I sent you. That was one of my, I hope you know, that was one of my one of my guys popping up.
Yeah. So I didn't have time. I was gonna actually start class with that. Because I love that picture. If you don't mind, I'll distribute that.
Not at all.
Because that's really exciting. Patrick is also doing some plant growth experiments.
Cool.
He's a little bit further south in North Carolina, so I think it's a bit warmer there, but he's already got plants coming up too. So, but great to see you got something coming up.
Yeah, so I went out and counted this morning. I have 20 that are popping up in the sand, not in any of the others. In sand is where it's the most. That's interesting.
Yeah. So you have any hypotheses yet or not?
No, not yet. I don't know. I have to go count the other ones to see. There's a couple in the other ones, but The most I think is in sand right now. In this.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
Well, yeah. So I mean, what that may mean is the most important thing to those plants is water management, and maybe that whatever the sand does, as opposed to the organic matter, it may be that the sand is creating an environment that's a better microenvironment for the moisture that those plants need.
I would yeah, that, and then just the pores that are allowed to be there, so the space, so there's too much compaction on the other ones.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Okay. I just wanted to express that to you because I was really excited when me and my girlfriend were out there like yesterday, and I couldn't see him. And she's like, "Oh, look, there's a little thing popping up." I was like, "What?" So excited.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. We'll talk to you later. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. Bye.